"Get him out," Vanessa said, not looking at the two men in gray blazers who'd been told to call themselves security for the night. "He doesn't work here. He's never worked here." Graham didn't move. He set his water glass down on the linen tablecloth, careful, like it mattered. "Ma'am, is this your husband?" one of the men asked. "He's nobody," she said. "Take him to the lobby." Somewhere behind her, Delaney laughed, short, satisfied, the laugh of a woman who'd been waiting years to hear those words said out loud. Colton didn't laugh. He watched Graham's hands, the way a man watches hands when he isn't sure yet if he should be worried. What none of them knew was that the building's deed, the ballroom's lease, and 41% of Hargrove Freight Holdings' voting shares all traced back to a single signature, Graham's, filed under a name none of them had ever bothered to look up. So why didn't he say a word as they took his arm? If you're new here, this is where real stories live, the ones where the quiet man in the room turns out to be the reason the room exists at all. Stay through this one. It's worth it. I need to go back to the beginning, because none of what happened in that ballroom makes sense without it. Graham Whitlock had spent 11 years telling people he did logistics consulting, which was technically true in the way that calling a river a puddle is technically true. He wore the same 3 gray sweaters in rotation. He drove a 9-year-old Silverado with a cracked windshield he never got around to fixing. When people asked what he did for a living at parties, he said it fast and changed the subject, and most people were happy to let him. The truth was that Graham owned Hargrove Freight Holdings outright through a holding company called Ashford Rail and Cartage that had no website and no public officers listed anywhere a casual search would find. 640 employees drew paychecks that traced back through 4 layers of paperwork to him. He had built it, or rebuilt it. From the wreckage of the company that had once employed his father as a dock supervisor, the same company that laid off 1,100 men in a single Tuesday morning meeting 19 years ago and gave his father a cardboard box and 4-week severance after 22 years of loading trucks in the same yard. His father had never gotten over it. Not the job, the humiliation of it, the way the plant manager wouldn't meet his eyes while he said the word restructuring. He'd carried a steel pocket watch his whole working life, an old railroad watch that had belonged to his own father, and on the day of the layoffs, walking out of that yard for the last time, he'd stopped it. Just stopped winding it. It sat in a drawer for 6 years, hands frozen at 417 until he died and Graham took it because nobody else wanted it. Graham had learned 2 things from watching his father come apart: that money without warning can end a person's dignity faster than any illness, and that the people who take it from you rarely think of themselves as the villain. They think of themselves as making a hard call. So when Graham, 11 years later, quietly assembled enough capital, through 3 lean years running his own trucking dispatch business, a well-timed inheritance from an uncle, and a partnership with a private equity contact who never once asked him to put his name on anything, to buy the bankrupt remains of the very company that broke his father, he didn't announce it. He didn't want a headline. He wanted the thing itself, 600 jobs that wouldn't disappear on a Tuesday, and a watch he could, eventually, decide whether or not to start again. He met Vanessa the year after the acquisition closed, at a diner outside Millbrook where she waited tables 3 nights a week while finishing her teaching certification. She had a laugh that came out before she meant it to, like it surprised her every time, and she talked about her 5th grade students with the kind of specific, exhausted love that Graham had never heard anyone use about a job before. He told her he did logistics work. She told him about a kid named Marcus who couldn't sit still until she let him stand at the back of the room to do his multiplication tables, and Graham thought, watching her hands move while she talked, that this was maybe the first uncomplicated thing that had happened to him in a decade. They married 18 months later in her parents' backyard, 40 guests, a borrowed sound system. And Graham's father's watch still stopped, sitting in his jacket pocket during the ceremony, because some part of him had decided he wanted it there even silent. Vanessa cried during his vows. He still remembered the exact sentence that did it. He'd said that he didn't need her to fix anything about him, only to notice him, because most of his life people had looked straight through him. She'd noticed him. For the first 4 years, that was the whole marriage, noticing in small, unglamorous ways. She kept his coffee order without asking. He learned to grade papers with her on Sunday nights, a red pen in each of their hands. It was Delaney, Vanessa's mother, who started the slow work of unmaking that. Delaney had never approved of Graham, not exactly, not out loud. She was too careful for that, too fluent in the kind of comment that could be denied later. At the wedding she'd told a cousin, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that she hoped Vanessa knew what she was signing up for, marrying a man with no real career to speak of. She said it while smiling. She was always smiling when she said the worst things. For the first years, Vanessa laughed the comments off, the way she laughed most things off. But Delaney was patient in a way that pressure usually is. Every dinner had a new comparison folded into it. A cousin's husband made partner, a neighbor's son bought a lake house, a sorority sister's fiancé flew business class to Zurich for work like it was nothing. Delaney never said Graham was a disappointment. She only ever described in loving detail what other men's wives got to have. She let Vanessa do the math herself. By year 5, Graham started noticing the shift in small, deniable ways. The particular silence that settled over Vanessa after a call with her mother. The way she'd started saying we should think bigger about the house, the car. The vacations, using a phrase that wasn't hers, that he recognized instantly as borrowed. He never told her the truth about Hargrove in those years, and looking back he understood that not telling her had been its own kind of decision. One he kept remaking every day without naming it. He told himself it was to protect what they had, that the moment money entered the marriage as a known quantity. Something in it would change shape permanently, the way his father's dignity had changed shape the instant a number got attached to his worth and found wanting. He wanted, foolishly maybe, to be loved by someone who didn't know there was a number at all. He didn't yet understand that a secret kept out of fear metabolizes, slowly into a secret kept out of habit. And that habit was already doing damage he couldn't see from the inside. It was at a 4th of July barbecue, the summer of their 6th year, that Colton first appeared at the edge of their lives, leaning against a Range Rover Sport that he'd parked deliberately crooked across 2 spaces. Gray Patek Philippe catching the light every time he moved his wrist, which was often. Because he wanted it seen. He was Delaney's second cousin's business associate, technically, though nobody could ever quite explain what the business was. He told a story within his first 10 minutes at that party about a 110-foot yacht he'd chartered in Positano the summer before, describing the crew, the color of the water. A specific bottle of wine that cost more than Graham's truck, and he told it looking directly at Vanessa the entire time, the way a salesman looks at the one person in the room he's actually decided to sell to. "What do you do, Graham?" Colton asked, already half turned away before the question finished leaving his mouth. "Logistics," Graham said. "Huh," Colton said, and smiled at Vanessa instead of at him. "Interesting," Vanessa laughed, the surprised laugh, the one Graham used to think was only his, and something in Graham went very still and very quiet, the way it had the day he watched his father set that pocket watch down in a drawer and never touch it again. That night, driving home, Vanessa talked about Colton's stories the way someone describes a movie they can't stop replaying. The yacht, the wine, a helicopter transfer he'd mentioned almost as an afterthought. Graham kept his eyes on the road and said the trucking business was steady, that a client in Ohio had extended a contract, and Vanessa said that's good in a tone that made it clear the sentence had already left her mind before it finished leaving his mouth. The comparisons Delaney had been planting for years found new, sharper soil once Colton was in regular orbit around the family. He started showing up at more gatherings than made sense for a second cousin's associate. A Labor Day cookout, Delaney's birthday dinner, a christening for a baby that belonged to someone none of them, including Colton, seemed to know especially well. Each time, he brought some fresh proof of a life conducted at a different altitude. A story about a private box at a Knicks game. A photo on his phone of a chalet in Aspen he described as ours, meaning some rotating consortium of people he never quite named. He was careful never to ask Vanessa anything that could be mistaken for a pass. He only ever made sure she was standing close enough to hear. Delaney noticed too, and did nothing to discourage it. At Thanksgiving that year, with Graham in the kitchen refilling the water pitcher, Graham heard his mother-in-law's voice carry through the doorway, pitched exactly as high as it needed to be to reach him without technically being aimed at him. "He's a good man," Delaney was saying. "Nobody's saying otherwise. I just think it's fair to wonder what Vanessa gave up. She could have had, well, someone like Colton, frankly, someone going somewhere. "Mom," Vanessa said, but Graham noted, standing very still with the pitcher sweating in his hand, that she hadn't said it the way a person says something they think is unfair. She'd said it the way a person says something they're embarrassed got said out loud in front of the wrong audience. He carried the water pitcher back to the table and refilled every glass at it, including Delaney's, and said nothing. The dismantling, once it started in earnest, didn't come as a single argument. It came as 1,000 small recalibrations. The way erosion always does, not a flood, just water finding the same crack in the same rock, year after year, until the rock had no memory of ever being whole. Vanessa began describing their house, a perfectly good 4-bedroom colonial Graham had bought outright the year before their wedding, as starter. She started using the phrase when we get somewhere about a future that apparently hadn't arrived yet, despite the fact that Graham quietly controlled assets that would have embarrassed most of the people at that Thanksgiving table into silence. He still didn't tell her, he told himself, driving home from the warehouse most nights past the loading docks where his father used to work, that the moment he said the number out loud, he'd never again know whether she was noticing him or the figure attached to him, and some stubborn wounded part of him needed, at least for a while longer, to believe it was still him. By the 7th year, Colton had a title, strategic partner, he called himself, at a company Graham could never quite get anyone to name specifically. Something involving growth capital and logistics innovation, phrases that meant nothing and were designed to. He began appearing at events specifically built around Graham's actual industry, always a half-step removed, always fluent enough in the vocabulary to sound credible to someone who didn't work in it, and completely hollow to someone who did. He asked Vanessa more than once in front of other people whether Graham had ever thought about doing something bigger with his trucks, in a tone that made trucks sound like a hobby a grown man should have outgrown. Vanessa stopped correcting him. That was the detail Graham noticed most, not that Colton said it, but that she let it sit there unchallenged, turning her wine glass by the stem, looking somewhere just past Graham's shoulder. At home that spring, she suggested, almost gently, that Graham might consider getting his name on something, the way Colton's name was on things, a fund, a deal memo, a masthead. She didn't know his name was on the deed to the building she'd have her 40th birthday party in, less than a year later. She only knew what she could see, and what she could see was a man in 3 gray sweaters who talked about Ohio contracts and came home smelling like diesel. Delaney, for her part, had begun a quieter campaign of her own, small dinners where Graham wasn't invited, just family, she'd say, though Colton increasingly was family by these definitions. She started referring to Colton, in front of Vanessa, as the kind of man who takes care of things, a phrase aimed, Graham understood clearly by then, less at describing Colton than at indicting him. He kept the watch in his sock drawer through all of it, stopped at 4:17, and some nights he took it out and held it without winding it, turning the cold steel case over in his palm, thinking about a man who lost everything to a number he never got to see coming, and wondering, with a specificity that frightened him a little, whether he was about to hand his own wife the exact same blindside, just from the opposite direction. The clearest early sign came at a golf outing Colton organized that August, ostensibly a charity scramble. Though Graham later learned the charity in question had dissolved 2 years earlier and Colton had simply kept using its name on the invitations. Graham went because Vanessa asked him to, in the small, hopeful voice she still used sometimes when she wanted the 2 halves of her life to get along. Colton met him on the 9th hole with a handshake that lasted a beat too long. Graham, "Vanessa talks about you all the time," he said, which Graham understood immediately to be a lie, because Vanessa had stopped mentioning him by name in front of Colton months ago, had started saying "my husband" instead, a small formal distance Graham had noticed and not known what to do with. "She talks about you too," Graham said, which was true. Colton laughed, easy, confident, a man who had never once in his life doubted that a room wanted him in it. "I keep telling her, a guy with your instincts for logistics, you're sitting on more than you think. You ever want to talk about actually scaling something? Real capital, real growth? I know people." He said real both times like it was a favor he was extending. "I'll keep it in mind," Graham said. "I mean it. Vanessa deserves—" Colton stopped himself there, smiled instead, clapped Graham once on the shoulder. "Anyway, good to finally spend some time with you, man." Graham watched him walk back toward the cart where Vanessa was waiting. watched Colton say something that made her laugh the surprised laugh, watched her glance back once toward Graham with an expression he couldn't fully name, something between apology and appraisal before the cart pulled away toward the next hole. He didn't say anything to her that night. He wrote down the name of the dissolved charity instead on the back of a gas receipt and put it in the drawer next to the watch, though he couldn't have said at the time what exactly he thought he was building toward. It would be almost a year before he understood that he'd started, without meaning to, the very case that would end everything. Part 2. The discovery happened on a Tuesday, which Graham would remember later only because he'd catalogued so many of the worst days of his life as Tuesdays by then, starting with the one that took his father's job. He'd come home early from Ashford's quarterly review, a little after 2, planning to surprise Vanessa with lunch from the place she liked on Route 9. Her car was in the driveway. Her laptop was open on the kitchen island, unlocked, the screen still lit from whatever she'd last been doing before she stepped away from it. He wasn't looking for anything. That was the part he kept returning to afterward. He hadn't gone looking. He'd only reached over to move the laptop so he could set down the takeout bag, and the trackpad woke the screen, and there it was, an email thread between Vanessa and Colton, 11 messages deep, the subject line reading simply us. He read it standing up, still in his coat. Colton had drafted a business plan, 12 pages, a logistics tech startup called Meridian Freight Solutions, built almost word for word on the operational model Graham had spent 11 years perfecting at Hargrove, down to route optimization language Graham recognized because he'd written it himself in an internal memo Vanessa had once, years ago. Glanced at over his shoulder at the kitchen table. Colton wanted Vanessa's name on the founding paperwork as a strategic advisor, a title that came with an 11% equity stake, and buried in an attached term sheet, access to a joint account the two of them had apparently opened 4 months earlier at a credit union 2 towns over, an account funded, so far, entirely by Vanessa, using money drawn from a home equity line against the house Graham owned outright. The last message in the thread wasn't about money. "I know this is complicated," Vanessa had written 10 days earlier. "I still love him, I just don't think he sees me anymore. I don't think he sees anything past those trucks." Colton's reply, sent 40 minutes later, "You deserve someone who sees the whole picture. I see it. I've seen it since the barbecue." Graham stood in his kitchen for a long time. He didn't feel the wave people talk about in these stories, no roaring in his ears, no room tilting sideways. What he felt was smaller and colder than that. A kind of arithmetic settling into place, a home equity line drained in secret, a stranger's name being built into a business stolen from his own methods, and underneath both of those, the sentence "I don't think he sees anything past those trucks," which was, he understood with a clarity that almost embarrassed him, the exact fear he'd been protecting himself from for 7 years. Arriving anyway, from the one direction he'd never fully guarded. He closed the laptop. He put the takeout bag in the refrigerator, still sealed. And then, instead of confronting her, instead of the version of this where he stood in the doorway when she came home and asked her to explain herself, he drove to Cecilia Frost's office instead. Cecilia had been Ashford Rail and Cartage's outside counsel for 9 years, ever since the original acquisition, and she was one of exactly 4 people alive who knew the full structure of what Graham owned. She was in her 50s, precise in a way that had nothing performative about it, the kind of lawyer who read footnotes other attorneys skipped. She'd suspected for years, without ever saying so directly, that something in Graham's marriage didn't match the picture he presented. She'd noticed, the way people who read documents for a living notice things, that he'd never once added Vanessa's name to anything. Not a single account, not the house, not even the emergency contact form at Ashford's HR office. She'd never asked why. That afternoon, sitting across from her, Graham told her. "Show me the account," Cecilia said, already reaching for a legal pad. He pulled it up on his phone, the credit union statement, the pattern of withdrawals against the home equity line, 6 of them over 4 months, each one just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic alert to Graham's own accountant. "Someone taught her how to stay under that number," Graham said. "Or someone with access to structuring advice did it for her," Cecilia said, not looking up from the pad. "This isn't naive. Somebody who does this for a living designed this." That single sentence did something to Graham that the emails hadn't quite managed. It moved what he'd found from a private wound into a documented pattern. Something with edges he could actually work against. "I want to know what Meridian Freight Solutions is," he said. "All of it. Filings, investors, everything with Colton's name on it." "That's not a weekend project," Cecilia said. "That's months." "I have months," Graham said. "I've had years." He almost confronted Vanessa that same week. He drafted the conversation in his head on the drive home 3 separate nights. "I saw the emails, I know about the account, I know his name." Twice he got as far as standing in the kitchen with her while she talked about her school day, the sentence sitting fully formed behind his teeth. Both times he didn't say it, and both times driving to Cecilia's office the next morning. He understood why, if he confronted her now with only an email thread and a bank statement, it would become his word about her intentions against hers, and Colton, a man who had clearly done this kind of thing before, would simply help her explain it away, help her believe her own explanation. Graham needed something that couldn't be explained away. He needed the whole shape of it, documented before he ever said a word, so he waited. He kept driving to the warehouse every morning in the Silverado. He kept eating dinner across from her, asking about Marcus and the multiplication tables, listening to her talk with a careful attention that cost him more than she ever knew. While 3 states away, Cecilia's contacts began quietly pulling the thread on Meridian Freight Solutions LLC. What they found over the following weeks went well past a business plan. Meridian had been incorporated 14 months earlier, long before the barbecue where Graham had first watched Colton lean against that Range Rover under a Delaware shell structure Colton had used twice before. In 2 different states, for 2 different companies that had each folded within 18 months after raising seed capital from a small group of investors who'd since stopped returning calls. Cecilia's forensic contact, a retired SEC examiner named Oliver Reed, who did this kind of quiet work for a handful of attorneys he trusted, found a pattern immediately recognizable to anyone who'd spent a career watching it. Colton didn't build companies. He built just enough of one, a slick deck, a credible-sounding advisor or 2, a story about traction to raise a round, extract a founder's draw and consulting fees for himself, and let the company quietly die once the money ran dry. Always landing softly enough to do it again somewhere else under a slightly different name. "He's done this 3 times that I can find in 6 years, Oliver told Graham and Cecilia over a conference call, his voice flat, unbothered, a man reciting facts he'd recited 100 times before about 100 other Coltons. "Your wife isn't an investor. She's the collateral. Her name and her equity access make the deck look like it has real assets behind it to someone who doesn't dig." He needed a Meridian door to walk through, and she was standing in it. Graham sat with that for a long moment. "And the money from the equity line?" "Consulting draws," Oliver said. "Paid to Colton personally twice, structured as loan repayments so they wouldn't show up as compensation. $41,000 so far. $41,000 was, to the version of Graham that most people in his life believed existed, a genuinely staggering sum, enough to explain on its own a certain kind of quiet fury. To the actual scope of what Graham controlled, it was closer to a rounding error, and some new, colder part of him understood that this discrepancy was, in its own way. The whole story, Colton had built an entire fraud around a woman he assumed had nothing real behind her, married to a man he'd dismissed on a golf course in under 30 seconds. And neither of them had the faintest idea what threshold they'd actually crossed, or whose money the home equity line had ultimately been secured against. Cecilia met Graham for coffee the week the Meridian file reached 400 pages. She slid a folder across the table but didn't let go of it right away. "I need to ask you something before you take this," she said. "Once you have all of this, the full picture, documented, defensible, what do you actually want to do with it?" "I want it to end," Graham said. "Cleanly, where it can't happen again to anyone else standing in that door." "That's not an answer to my question." Graham looked at the folder without opening it. "I know," he said. "I'm still working on the real one." Cecilia let go of the folder. "There's a Gala," she said. "Hargrove's annual fundraiser, the one your holding company underwrites every year under the Ashford name. Vanessa's on the planning committee. Has been for 3 years. Delaney chairs the guest list. Colton's already RSVP'd, apparently as Vanessa's business contact." She said the phrase with the precise dry distaste of someone quoting evidence. "If you're building toward a moment, that room already exists. You wouldn't even have to build one. Graham thought about the ballroom he owned, under a name none of them had ever thought to check, filled with people who had spent 7 years explaining to each other exactly what he wasn't. He thought about his father's watch, still stopped at 4:17 in the sock drawer, still waiting for him to decide what time it was supposed to say. "Not yet," he said. "I want the rest first. All of it. I'm not walking into that room until there's nothing left for either of them to explain away." Cecilia nodded, unsurprised, and opened her legal pad to a fresh page. "Then let's talk about what's still missing." The temptation to break early came back once more, sharper than before, on a Sunday in late September. Vanessa had made pasta, the same recipe from their second year of marriage, and halfway through dinner she reached across the table and took his hand, unprompted, the way she used to before Colton's name had a shape in either of their lives. "You seem far away lately," she said. "Is it work?" For a moment Graham considered simply telling her everything, not as an accusation, but as an offering, the way you'd hand someone a live wire and let them decide what to do with it. He had the folder in the truck. He had Oliver's report memorized almost line for line. He opened his mouth once, closed it, and then asked instead about a field trip she'd chaperoned that week, and she told him about it. Animated, unaware, her hand still resting over his on the table. He drove to Cecilia's office again the next morning before the warehouse opened. "I almost told her last night," he said. "What stopped you?" "She held my hand," Graham said, and heard how strange it sounded out loud. "And I realized if I told her then, with nothing but an email thread and a bank statement, in 5 years she'd remember the version of the story where I ambushed her over pasta. Colton's smart enough to help her build that memory. I need the version where there's nothing left to reframe." Cecilia didn't try to talk him out of the delay, but she didn't let it pass without weight either. "Waiting isn't neutral, Graham. Every week you don't say anything is a week you're choosing this over the version where you just ask her directly and see what she says." "I know," he said. "I chose it 7 years ago, the day I decided not to tell her what I owned. I'm not going to pretend this is different in kind, just in stakes." She let that sit, then slid a new folder across the table, bank records this time, 7 pages, freshly pulled. "Then you'll want to see this before you decide anything else." The new records showed a 7th withdrawal against the home equity line. 2 weeks old, larger than the previous 6 combined $63,000, transferred not to the Meridian operating account this time, but directly to a personal account in Colton's name, memo line left blank. Oliver's notes, stapled to the back page, laid out what he'd found once he traced it further. The transfer had gone out 9 days after Colton quietly missed a filing deadline that would have kept Meridian's Delaware registration active, meaning the company Vanessa believed she held equity in had technically stopped existing before the money ever left her account. Graham read the notes twice. He let it lapse and kept taking money anyway. He let it lapse and kept taking money from her specifically, Cecilia said. Not from investors who might ask questions he couldn't answer, from the one person in that deal who trusted him enough not to check. Graham sat with the folder open in his lap for a long time before he spoke again. "How long until we have enough to make it airtight?" 3 weeks, Cecilia said. "Maybe less, if Oliver gets the wire records from the credit union without a fight." "Then we have 3 weeks, Graham said, and closed the folder. Part 3 The Gala fell on the 3rd Saturday of October, in the ballroom of the Hargrove Atrium, a building whose deed listed Ashford Rail and Cartage as sole owner. A fact that existed on public record in a filing cabinet nobody in that room had ever had reason to open. Vanessa wore green. She'd spent 40 minutes on her hair that afternoon and asked Graham, almost shy about it, whether the dress looked like too much. He told her it didn't, and meant it, and felt the particular ache of meaning something kind to someone he was about to end an entire version of his life with. Cecilia and Oliver were both there, seated at a table near the back, unremarkable in the way professionals learn to be. The final documentation had come together 4 days earlier, wire records, the lapsed Delaware filing. 2 prior Meridian-style companies fully traced and, buried in Oliver's last report, something Cecilia had insisted Graham see for himself before the night. A message from Colton to an old associate, 11 months old, that Colton had apparently forgotten still existed on a shared drive Oliver's contact had access to. Wife's loaded, or the husband is, it read. Either way, she doesn't ask questions if you make her feel seen. Working the account slow. Graham had read it once and put it away. He hadn't shown it to Vanessa. Some things he'd decided she needed to hear from Colton's own mouth, in front of enough witnesses that no one could later help her doubt what she'd heard. Delaney found them near the bar an hour into the evening, Colton a half-step behind her, dressed like a man who'd been told this was the kind of room where dressing well mattered more than the reason he was in it. "Graham," Delaney said, not quite looking at him, "I didn't realize you were coming tonight." "I'm on the committee's vendor list," Graham said, which was, in its way, the truth. "Figured I'd see how the place turned out." "How generous of Ashford to sponsor this," Delaney said, gesturing vaguely at the room, the chandeliers, the ice sculpture of the Hargrove logo melting slowly near the entrance. "Vanessa's worked so hard on this committee. It's nice she has something of her own." Colton put a hand briefly on the small of Vanessa's back as she rejoined them, an easy, proprietary gesture, and said, "The room looks incredible. Really, this is the kind of event that gets people talking." He looked at Graham for the first time that night, the same half-turned-away look from the golf course 2 years earlier. "Logistics still keeping you busy, Graham?" "Something like that," Graham said. Vanessa's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, frowned slightly, and Graham watched Delaney lean in close to her daughter's ear and say something too quiet for him to catch, though he'd learn later exactly what it was, because Delaney would repeat a version of it loudly enough for half the room within the hour. The moment came just after the keynote toast, when the Hargrove board chair, a woman named Renata Suss, who had chaired the board for 6 years and answered, though almost no one in that room knew it, directly to Ashford Rail and Cartage, stepped to the podium to thank the evening's anonymous lead sponsor, a phrase she used every year without incident, until this year, when a junior board member leaned toward Delaney's table and trying to make conversation. Mentioned that the sponsor's paperwork had crossed his desk that week and the registered agent's name had looked oddly familiar. "Whitlock," he said. "Isn't that your son-in-law's name, Delaney?" Delaney laughed, the short satisfied laugh from years of practice. "I doubt it. Graham does trucking dispatch out of a rented lot in Millbrook." That was when she saw Graham was standing close enough to have heard her. Something in her face didn't like being caught mid-sentence, and it curdled fast into something meaner. She raised her voice, deliberately now, loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. "Actually, since we're all here, I think it's worth asking why my daughter's husband is even on this guest list. He's not a donor. He's not staff." She turned to the security detail stationed near the entrance, hired for the evening through the same events company Vanessa's committee had used for 3 years running. "Could someone please see this gentleman out? He doesn't belong at this table." Vanessa's face went through something complicated, a flicker of protest, quickly overtaken by something else. Something closer to relief that the decision had been made for her. "Mom," she started, then stopped. "He's nobody," Delaney said louder now, enjoying the small crowd that had begun to gather. "Take him to the lobby." 2 men in gray blazers stepped forward. One of them looked at Vanessa. "Ma'am, is this your husband?" Vanessa looked at Graham for a long moment, long enough that later, replaying it, he understood it as the last moment in which she could have chosen differently and hadn't. "He's nobody," she said. "He's never worked here." Colton watched Graham's hands the whole time, the way a man watches hands when he isn't sure yet whether he should be worried. Graham set his water glass down on the linen tablecloth, careful, like it mattered, and let the 2 men take his arm. He didn't resist. He wanted, very specifically, for this exact image, Graham Whitlock being walked out of his own building by men he was paying, to exist in as many memories in that room as possible, because it was the only image that would make what came next legible. He let them walk him as far as the edge of the dance floor before Renata Suss's voice cut across the room from the podium, sharp with confusion rather than performance. "Wait, hold on. Security, stop." She was staring at a printout someone had just handed her, the same registered agent filing the junior board member had mentioned minutes earlier. "This says the building's ownership entity is Ashford Rail and Cartage, registered agent Graham Whitlock." She looked up, scanning the room, and found him standing between the 2 blazers with his water still faintly damp on his fingers. "Graham? Is that are you Ashford?" The room's noise dropped by half, then further, in the particular cascading silence of 200 people simultaneously deciding to eavesdrop. "I am," Graham said. "You own the atrium," Renata said. It wasn't quite a question anymore. "I own the atrium. I own Hargrove Freight Holdings. I have for 11 years. He said it plainly, without theater the way Cecilia had coached him to say it. Facts first, feelings later if at all. "I bought it out of bankruptcy the year after it laid off 1,100 people in a single meeting, including my father. 640 of you work for me right now, tonight. Some of you serving this dinner." Delaney's mouth had gone very still. Colton's hand had come off Vanessa's back at some point Graham hadn't noticed. "That's not..." Delaney started and then didn't finish. Because there was nothing after "that's not" that the room would have believed. Vanessa hadn't moved. "Graham," she said, quiet now, the anger gone out of her voice entirely. Replaced by something closer to the beginning of arithmetic. "What is she talking about?" "Ask him," Graham said and nodded once toward Colton, "what Meridian Freight Solutions is. Ask him when its Delaware registration lapsed. Ask him where the $63,000 from our home equity line went 9 days after that." Colton's face did something Graham had been waiting 2 years to see, the practiced ease dropping away all at once, replaced by the flat, fast calculation of a man realizing the room he was in no longer had an exit that led anywhere good. "I don't know what he's talking about," Colton said too quickly, to Vanessa, not to Graham. "You will," Graham said. "Everyone in this room will before the night's over. I made sure of that." The two men in gray blazers, still holding Graham loosely by each arm, looked at each other and, without either of them saying anything, let go. Renata came down off the podium, the printout still in her hand. "Graham, I need to understand this correctly, in front of everyone. Because half this board is about to ask me the same thing in the morning. You've owned Ashford, and through it this building and Hargrove for 11 years? 11 years in March," Graham said, "and you never told the board." "I never told anyone," Graham said. "That was the point. Why?" Renata asked, not hostile, just genuinely trying to close the gap between the man she'd seen refilling water pitchers at 3 prior galas and the name on the filing in her hand. "Because the last time a company decided what my father was worth, they did it in a 5-minute meeting and handed him a box," Graham said. "I didn't want to be a name on a masthead. I wanted the 600 people who work here to still have jobs on a Tuesday morning." A woman near the back, Graham recognized her, distantly as one of the warehouse floor supervisors said, quiet but audible in the hush, "That's Whitlock? From the memo about the pension match?" And the sentence rippled outward through 2 more tables before Renata raised a hand for quiet. Vanessa hadn't moved from where she stood, one hand braced on the edge of the table, staring at Graham like she was recalculating the last 7 years in real time. "You let them call you nobody," she said. "You just stood there and let my mother say it." "I've let a lot of things get said," Graham said. "Tonight was the last one." Delaney found her voice again, thinner now, aimed at damage control rather than attack. "This is absurd. Vanessa, we don't know that any of this is." "Don't," Vanessa said, and it was the first time all night her voice had any edge in it aimed somewhere other than Graham. "Don't you dare finish that sentence right now." Colton had started carefully to angle himself toward the exit, one hand already reaching for his jacket off the back of his chair. Graham caught the motion and didn't raise his voice, didn't need to, the room was quiet enough now that he didn't have to. "Leave right now and every filing I have goes to the state's attorney by Monday instead of by Wednesday," Graham said. "Stay, and you can explain the Delaware lapse to your face instead of to a subpoena. Your choice which version you'd rather be in the room for." Colton's hand stopped on the chair back. He didn't sit down. He didn't leave either. "There's more of this," Graham said to the room now, not just to the 3 of them. "I'd rather not do all of it standing here in front of your dinner. But I will, if that's what it takes for everyone to understand exactly what's been happening in this family for the last 2 years." Part 4 by Monday morning, the version of the story circulating through Hargrove's offices had already outpaced anything Graham could have engineered on purpose, and he found he didn't need to add much to it. The documents did the rest on their own. Colton's collapse came first, and came fastest, because his was the version built on the least real ground to begin with. Cecilia filed the complete Meridian file with the Delaware Division of Corporations and, separately with the state attorney's office, on the Wednesday deadline Graham had named at the gala, not a day earlier, exactly as promised. The filing detailed all three failed shell companies, the pattern of consulting draws structured as loan repayments, and the message Colton had sent 11 months earlier calling Vanessa loaded and describing his plan to work her account slow. Two of Colton's previous investors, having quietly followed the trail Oliver's report opened up, filed their own civil complaints within the same week. And by the following Friday, a business journalist covering Delaware shell company fraud had run a piece naming Colton directly, using court filings as its primary source. He did not attend the follow-up meeting Cecilia's office requested. He did not respond to certified mail sent to his last known address. The Range Rover Graham heard secondhand from Oliver had been repossessed by early November. Delaney's undoing was slower and in its way crueler. Because nothing about it was illegal, it was simply social, and social collapse moves at the speed of a phone tree. The story of the gala spread through her own circle before Graham had said a single additional word to anyone. The woman who'd spent 7 years telling people her son-in-law had no real career to speak of had, it turned out, been condescending for years to the man who quietly employed 600 people, including, Graham later confirmed, the husband of one of Delaney's own bridge partners. Invitations that had reliably arrived for a decade stopped arriving. She called Vanessa 4 times in the 2 weeks after the gala. Vanessa let 3 of them go to voicemail, and on the 4th, told her mother plainly that she needed distance to figure out how much of the last 7 years had actually been her own thinking versus a script she'd been handed one comparison at a time. Delaney did not, as far as Graham ever learned, apologize, not once, not to Vanessa and not to him, but she stopped attending events where either of their names might come up, which was, Cecilia observed dryly, the closest thing to an admission Delaney was constitutionally capable of producing. Vanessa's reckoning took longer than either of the others, and unlike theirs. Graham found he had no appetite for watching it happen from a distance. She moved out of the house 9 days after the gala, into her sister's spare room, not because Graham asked her to, but because, she told him, standing in the driveway with a single suitcase, she needed to know what she thought and felt about her own marriage without his money or her mother's voice sitting in the room while she figured it out. "I want to know if I still recognize myself once neither of those things is talking," she said. And Graham, who understood something about needing distance from a family's version of who you were supposed to be, told her he thought that was the first honest thing either of them had said to the other in 2 years. Over the following month, in 3 long conversations that Cecilia knew nothing about and that Graham never turned into evidence of anything, Vanessa told him what she now understood clearly in hindsight, that Colton had never once asked her a real question about her students, her actual days, the parts of her life that had nothing to do with what she could unlock for him. And that somewhere around year 5 she'd started mistaking being flattered for being seen, because Delaney had spent a decade training her to measure love in the same currency as everything else. The forensic unraveling of Meridian's finances, finished out over the following 6 weeks, exposed the full mechanics of what Colton had actually built, not a business with a flawed plan, but a device. Purpose-built to extract just enough capital from people whose trust made them slow to check the paperwork, structured to fail quietly enough each time that no single failure looked like a pattern from the outside. Oliver's final report ran to 60 pages and traced 11 separate individuals across 3 states who'd lost money to versions of the same structure going back 6 years. Several of whom had, like Vanessa, been drawn in through a personal relationship rather than a cold pitch. Reading it, Graham understood something he hadn't fully let himself see clearly at the gala, that Vanessa hadn't been an aberration in Colton's method. She'd been exactly the kind of target the method was built for. And the only thing unusual about her case was who she happened to be married to. Graham, for his part, spent those same weeks doing something he realized he'd never once done in 11 years of ownership. He let Hargrove's own employees learn who Ashford actually was. He held an all-staff meeting at the Millbrook warehouse the 2nd week of November. No press, no cameras. Just 600 people crowded into a loading bay that still smelled faintly of diesel, and told them, in roughly the same plain sentences he'd used at the gala, why he'd bought the company and why he'd never wanted his name on it. A woman near the front, the floor supervisor from the Gala, he learned her name was Paige Kessler, asked him afterward, quietly, whether the pension match he'd expanded 3 years earlier under Ashford's name had actually been his idea. He told her it had. She didn't say much else. She just nodded once, like something had been confirmed that she'd suspected for a while, and went back to her shift. The one direct exchange Graham had with Colton after the Gala came by accident, not design. A deposition Cecilia's office scheduled as part of the civil complaint, which Graham hadn't planned to attend in person until Cecilia mentioned, almost offhand, that Colton had specifically asked whether he would be there. Graham went. He sat at the far end of the conference table and said nothing for most of the 2 hours, listening to Colton's attorney work through careful, hedged answers about consulting fees and structuring decisions until the very end when Cecilia asked the one question she'd told Graham beforehand she intended to ask. Mr. Reyes, did you ever, at any point in the 18 months you knew Vanessa Whitlock, have a romantic interest in her independent of her financial access? Colton's attorney started to object, then let it go, apparently deciding the answer would do less damage than the fight over the question. Colton looked, for the first time all afternoon, directly at Graham instead of at his own lawyer. I liked her, Colton said. I want that on the record. I liked her. That's not what I asked, Cecilia said. Colton was quiet for a moment. No, he said finally. Not independent of it. I don't think I know how to separate those two things anymore. I'm not sure I ever did. It was the only true thing Graham ever heard him say, and it confirmed, more completely than any bank record had, exactly what Oliver's 60-page report had already laid out in numbers, that for Colton, charm had never been a feeling extended toward a person, only a tool calibrated toward an asset, and that somewhere along the way, maybe years before Vanessa, maybe from the very beginning of whatever had made him this way, he'd stopped being able to tell the difference between the two, if he'd ever been able to at all. Delaney's last real attempt at repair came the week before Thanksgiving. In the form of a card left in Vanessa's sister's mailbox rather than a phone call, which Graham understood secondhand to be its own kind of admission, Delaney had never once in 7 years put anything difficult in writing, preferring the deniability of a raised eyebrow or a pitched-to-carry comment at dinner. The card said in 3 lines, that she hoped Vanessa knew she'd only ever wanted her to have more, and that she was sorry if that had ever been misunderstood. Vanessa read it once out loud to Graham over the phone, and neither of them said anything for a while afterward. She still doesn't think she did anything, Vanessa said finally. She thinks the only mistake was that we found out. Graham didn't disagree with her. He'd stopped expecting Delaney to arrive anywhere close to an apology built on anything other than being caught. And some part of him understood that this too was its own kind of consequence, not a punishment he'd engineered, just a woman finally meeting the version of herself she'd spent a decade constructing for other people to admire. Part 5 in early December, with the civil complaint moving forward on its own momentum and 2 additional plaintiffs added to the case against Colton in the space of a single week, Cecilia came to Graham with a question she'd been sitting on since the Gala. You could push for criminal fraud charges on the structuring alone, she said. Oliver's report would support it. You could also go after Delaney's real estate license. I found the state complaint process is more permissive than most people think, and given what she said publicly at a chartered event, there's an argument. Graham thought about it for longer than Cecilia expected him to. No, he said finally, not the license. Not criminal charges beyond what the state decides to pursue on its own without me pushing it. Can I ask why? After everything. Because the second I start using what I have to ruin people beyond what actually happened to us, I stop being the person who bought this company to protect 600 jobs and start being the person my father's old employer already was, Graham said. I watched what it does to a man to have someone with more leverage than him decide casually how much of his life he gets to keep. I'm not going to be that, even with someone who deserves it more than my father's old bosses ever did. Cecilia studied him for a moment. And the 600 employees? They're the actual reason, Graham said. Half of Hargrove's floor staff are related to somebody at that gala. One way or another, cousins, in-laws, kids who go to school with Delaney's book club friends' grandkids. If this turns into a public war instead of a closed civil matter, it's not Colton or Delaney who eats the fallout at the holiday party. It's Paige. It's the guy who's covered 3 shifts because his wife's on leave. I didn't build this company back to make my own life easier. I'm not going to burn it down for the same reason. He let the state attorney's office and the civil courts handle what they were already handling, declined 2 separate opportunities to comment publicly on the record, and quietly arranged, through Cecilia, for Hargrove's legal fund to cover the costs for the 2 other plaintiffs in Colton's case who couldn't otherwise afford to pursue it. Support he asked to remain unattributed, though Oliver, who processed the paperwork, told Cecilia privately that he suspected at least one of the plaintiffs had figured out where the money actually came from and simply chosen not to say anything about it. A week after that conversation with Cecilia, Graham drove out to the Millbrook warehouse on a Friday afternoon, ostensibly to review year-end numbers, and found Paige Kessler finishing a shift near the loading bay where he'd held the all-staff meeting in November. She was the one who'd asked him about the pension match. He hadn't planned to talk to her again so soon, but she waved him over before he could decide whether to. "There's a rumor going around the floor that you're about to go scorched earth on the guy who tried to con your family," Paige said, not unkindly, just direct in the way people who'd spent years around forklifts tended to be. "Half the warehouse thinks you should. My cousin's married to one of the guys who lost money to him a few years back, different company, same setup apparently." "I heard," Graham said. "I'm covering the legal costs for your cousin's husband and the other plaintiff," quietly. "Cecilia's handling it so it doesn't trace back." Paige studied him for a second. "But you're not going after the mother-in-law's license? Or pushing extra charges?" "No," Graham said. "Why not? Nobody here would blame you." Graham thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because the last time somebody with more power than my father decided how much of his life to take, they didn't stop to think about who else it would land on. I'm not going to run this company, or handle this, the same way they ran him out of a job in a 5-minute meeting. If I let this turn into something bigger than what actually happened, the people who eat that fallout aren't Colton or Delaney. It's everybody standing in this bay right now." Paige nodded slowly, the same nod she'd given him in November. "That's a better answer than most people in your position would bother giving," she said, and went back to closing out her shift. And Graham stood in the loading bay a while longer, in the cold air smelling faintly of diesel, before driving home. Vanessa came back to the house on the 2nd Saturday of December, not to move back in. That conversation, both of them agreed, needed more time than either of them had given it yet, but to talk, sitting across from each other at the same kitchen table where the pasta dinner had happened months earlier. "I keep trying to figure out the exact day I stopped seeing you clearly," she said. "I can't find it. I think that's what scares me most. It wasn't a day. It was just smaller and smaller, for years, until I looked up and didn't recognize what I'd let myself believe." "I did the same thing, just in the opposite direction," Graham said. "I decided not to tell you the truth about Hargrove so many times, in so many small moments, that eventually it stopped feeling like a decision at all. It just felt like who I was." He reached into his jacket pocket and set his father's watch on the table between them, the steel case scratched from 2 decades of being carried and almost never opened. "I've had this stopped since he lost his job, 19 years. I told myself I was keeping it as a reminder. I think somewhere along the way it became an excuse instead, a reason to keep everyone, including you, at exactly the distance where nobody could take anything else from me." Vanessa picked it up, turned it over once in her hand, the way he had 100 times in the sock drawer over the years. "What time does it say?" 4:17, Graham said. The exact time he clocked out that day. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she asked quietly, "Are you going to start it again?" "I don't know yet," Graham said. "I think I wanted to ask you the same question about us before I decided anything else." Neither of them answered that fully. That afternoon, some things, they both seemed to understand without saying so, weren't going to resolve on the same timeline as a lawsuit or a company's paperwork. But she left the watch on the table when she left, instead of handing it back, which Graham understood, turning it over in his own hand after her car pulled out of the driveway, as its own kind of answer, not a yes, not yet, but a willingness to let the question stay open between them a little longer instead of closing it by default. He wound it that night, for the first time in 19 years. He didn't reset the hands right away. He just let it run forward from 4:17, watching the second-hand move for the first time in his adult life, and decided that was enough for one evening. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you already know it isn't really about the money, or the ballroom, or even about Colton and Delaney, as satisfying as it might have felt watching two people who built their confidence on other people's blind spots finally run out of room to stand in. It's about the quieter, harder thing underneath all of it, how easy it is. In a marriage, or a family, or just a life, to let silence do the work that honesty was supposed to do, until the distance you built to protect yourself becomes the very thing that lets someone else walk in and take what honesty would have kept safe in the first place. Graham didn't get everything back that he wanted that December. He got something more useful instead, the chance to find out, slowly and on purpose this time, whether the people left standing in his life could see him clearly once there was nothing left to hide. If this story meant something to you, you know exactly what to do. Hit subscribe, because the next one's already waiting, and it might be the one that hits closest to home.